It was late afternoon on the day we buried her. The towering wrought iron candelabras cast a cold, flickering light across the dozens of mourners in their somber black trading hollow condolences in hushed voices. My name is Edmund Hargrove, 70 years old, and in that moment I felt as though everything inside me had been scooped clean. I had on a tailored navy suit that suddenly felt 2 sizes too big for my shrinking frame. The 3 days prior, I'd drifted through my own life like a ghost. Welcome back to Dad Revenge. I'm glad you're here with me today. Before we get into this story, do me a small favor and drop a quick comment. Just tell me what you're up to right now while you're listening. Are you driving somewhere, cooking in the kitchen, resting after a long day, or maybe working through something on your own? I'd genuinely love to know. Now, a quick note, some elements of this story have been shaped for the purpose of storytelling, and any resemblance to real individuals or events is purely coincidental. What matters most is the truth underneath it all. Eleanor was gone. The one woman who had ever truly seen the man behind the CEO title of Hargrove Developments was lying cold in the ground. I desperately needed a moment just to breathe. The endless handshakes, the pitying glances from corporate partners, the crocodile tears from distant relatives angling for a handout. All of it was becoming more than I could stand. I gave a polite nod to a cluster of investors and slipped away from the crowded living room, retreating into the darkened quiet of the hallway that led to my private study. The heavy oak doors and thick Persian rugs swallowed the murmur of the wake. I only wanted 5 minutes of absolute silence. 5 minutes to shut my eyes, press my back against the wall, and pretend that Eleanor was still upstairs, curled up with her favorite novels by the bay window, the way she had spent every Sunday for decades. But as I neared the half-open door of my study, I caught voices, familiar, hushed voices. My daughter-in-law Claudia and my son Garrett. They had apparently peeled away from the guests as well, to find themselves a private corner. I paused in the shadows on the verge of pushing the door open and asking them to clear out so I could have some peace. But Claudia's words stopped me cold. "Can you actually believe he spent $35,000 on that casket?" Claudia scoffed. Every trace of the sweet, gentle tone she'd been performing for the guests all afternoon had vanished. It's solid mahogany Garrett. $35,000 just to go into the dirt. Do you have any idea what we could have done with that money? To the return on investment we could have gotten if he'd simply handed it to us. It's completely irresponsible and ridiculous. I stood frozen in that dark hallway, my hand hovering inches from the brass doorknob. My wife, the woman who had welcomed Claudia into this family without hesitation, who had showered her with gifts and defended her, every shortcoming had been laid to rest only hours ago. And my daughter-in-law was standing inside my own home, grumbling about the price of her final resting place. A cold, hard knot pulled tight deep in my gut. I waited for my son, my own flesh and blood, the boy I had raised and shaped to defend his mother. I waited for him to demand some basic respect. Instead, I heard Garrett sigh. It was a weak, hollow sound. "I know, Claudia," he mumbled softly. But Dad was completely overcome. You know how he gets when things pile up on him. He wasn't thinking clearly. He just wanted the absolute best for Mom. He is not thinking clearly at all. Claudia's heels snapped against the hardwood floor as she paced around my desk. "And that is precisely my point, Garrett. Look at him out there. He's an absolute wreck. He's weak. A stiff breeze could put him on the ground. Now that the old woman is gone, we need to take the reins before he starts tearing apart assets out of sheer grief. He is sitting on a massive real estate empire and acting like a lost child." I pressed my back flat against the cold plaster wall and held my breath. The crushing grief that had been pinned to my chest for days dissolved in an instant. In its place came an icy, razor-sharp clarity. The corporate wolf who had built Hargrove Developments from a single rented office into a multi-million-dollar empire stirred back to life. I closed my eyes and let the poison keep flowing. "You need to step up right now, Garrett." Claudia's voice dropped to a sharp, commanding whisper. "You are the chief operating officer. You are the only heir. Next month, we need to bring up Ivory Glen." Ivory Glen?" Garrett asked, his voice trembling slightly. "Claudia, that is a nursing home and assisted living facility. You cannot be serious right now. Dad is only 70 years old. He still runs the board of directors. He's sharp. He is not simply going to agree to be locked away in a medical facility. He will if we handle it correctly." Claudia hissed, her voice laced with venom. "Ivory Glen is a luxury facility. We don't call it a nursing home. We frame it as an exclusive health retreat. We tell him his blood pressure is a serious concern. We tell him the immense stress of running the company without Eleanor at his side is going to kill him. We get his private doctors on the payroll. We wear his mind down day after day. Once he's safely tucked away in there, we get him to sign over the controlling shares to you and little Finn. The old man is oblivious, Garrett. He trusts us without question. Push hard enough, play the devoted family card long enough, and he'll hand over the keys to the kingdom just to get some peace." "But his lawyer," Garrett stammered, sounding utterly terrified of his own wife. "Raymond Keswick is an absolute shark. He has managed Dad's corporate and private accounts for 30 years. Raymond will never let him sign over the trust without a brutal legal fight. He'll ask far too many questions." "Let me worry about Raymond Keswick," Claudia said, dismissing it with a wave. "I have Finn. This entire family revolves around my son. Your father worships the ground that boy walks on. He will do anything to lock in his only grandson's future. The entire Hargrove legacy is going to fall right into our laps by the end of the year. You just have to stop being so spineless and do exactly what I tell you." I kept my eyes closed in the dark. The sheer audacity of her words felt like a blade turning slowly between my ribs. This woman lived in a $2 million house in the suburbs that I had bought outright with cash. Her designer wardrobe and luxury vacations had been paid for entirely with my money. Her whole life was built on the back of my labor. And here she stood in my sanctuary, plotting to have me declared mentally incompetent and shipped away. And my son, the boy I had groomed to be a strong leader, was standing there letting her engineer my destruction without a single word of protest. My hands curled into tight fists. My knuckles went white. Every instinct I had screamed for immediate confrontation. I wanted to storm through that door. I wanted to shout at them, to physically throw them out of my house in front of every last guest. I wanted to strip Garrett of his executive title on the spot. But 30 years of ruthless corporate warfare had hammered one absolute truth into me. You never strike when you're angry. You strike when you are fully prepared. If I went through that door right now, Claudia would play the victim without missing a beat. She'd turn on the tears, claim she was overwhelmed by grief, say I had twisted her words. She would cover her tracks and bury the evidence. No, I was not going to hand her that opportunity. I was going to let her perfect lie breathe. I was going to let her believe she had a clueless, broken, grieving old man on her hands. I would play along with their game until I held every piece of leverage needed to bring them down completely. I began to ease backward from the door, intending to return to the reception and perform the role of the frail widower they expected me to be. I took one careful step back into the deep shadows, and then my leather dress shoe caught the very edge of an old, loose floorboard. A loud, sharp creak tore through the silent hallway. It rang out like a gunshot in the stillness of the house. The hushed voices inside the study went dead. Silence, heavy, terrifying silence, fell over the room. "Who's out there?" Claudia demanded, her voice suddenly sharp and wound tight with nerves. I went completely still, my heart hammering against my ribs. I could hear the quick, precise tap of her expensive heels moving fast toward the doorway. The heavy wooden door swung open, throwing a long blade of yellow light into the dark hallway. Claudia stepped out, eyes narrowing as they worked to cut through the shadows where I stood. Garrett appeared right at her shoulder, looking pale, guilty, and frightened out of his wits. I stayed absolutely motionless in the dark, barely drawing breath, watching my daughter-in-law stare directly toward my hiding spot. The mournful, loving smile she had performed for the guests all day was gone, entirely replaced by a cold, calculating, predatory glare. Had she seen me? Did she know she had been heard every last word of her greedy, vicious scheme? For 3 agonizing seconds, the silence of that hallway pressed down on my chest like a stone. Claudia's sharp gaze swept through the dim light, passing right over the shadow where I stood. Then the antique grandfather clock in the grand foyer began to chime, shattering the tension. I let out a long, shuddering breath and deliberately stepped forward into the edge of the light. I let my shoulders cave inward, rounding my back to shed my usual commanding posture. I made my hands tremble slightly, pressing my fingertips to my temples, as if the weight of the day had completely scrambled my bearings. The moment the hallway light caught my face, Claudia's expression shifted entirely. It was a masterclass in cold-blooded manipulation. The calculating glare dissolved in an instant, replaced by the soft, fussily concerned smile she had spent years perfecting for the country club set. Garrett exhaled audibly behind her, practically wilting against the wooden doorframe with relief. "Edmund," Claudia breathed, rushing forward to wrap a warm hand around my arm. "You startled us. We were just coming to find you. You should not be wandering these dark halls alone today." I looked at her, fighting every impulse that screamed at me to wrench my arm free of her grip. "I just needed some quiet," I murmured, keeping my voice frail and spent. "The crowd out there is simply too much right now." "We know, Dad." Garrett cut in, suddenly finding his nerve now that the threat had apparently passed. He stepped out of the study, straightening his expensive silk tie with a confident hand. "We were actually just talking about you, about your health." Claudia steered me gently toward the kitchen, her grip firm, guiding me almost like a fragile child being walked to bed. "I was just telling Garrett that we should look into a luxury health retreat for you," she cooed, settling me onto a bar stool and pouring hot water into a delicate bone china teacup. "Your blood pressure has been dangerously high these past few months with Eleanor's illness. We were looking at a beautiful place called Ivory Glen. It has around-the-clock nurses and stunning private gardens. You would not have to worry about a single thing, so Garrett can manage the developments while you finally get some proper rest. Ivory Glen, a luxury health retreat." The lie slid off her tongue with breathtaking smoothness, wrapped in a thick coating of counterfeit compassion. I took the teacup from her hands and felt the warmth seep into my cold fingers. I stared down at the dark, amber liquid and thought about my beautiful Eleanor. My late wife had spent 5 years defending this woman. Every time I raised concerns about Claudia's reckless spending or her cutting, condescending manner, Eleanor would lay a gentle hand against my cheek and ask me to be patient. She would say that Garrett had finally found someone who made him happy, that Claudia just needed time to settle into our family's world. To honor Eleanor, I had endured the outrageous credit card bills, the endless luxury trips, the thinly veiled disrespect dressed up as modern independence. But Eleanor was gone now, and the shield that had protected Claudia was gone with her. A health retreat. I repeated slowly, letting my voice waver just enough to seem rattled by the idea. "You think I need to go away?" just for a little while, Dad," Garrett said, dropping a heavy hand onto my shoulder. "You built this company from nothing. You gave us everything. But you're grieving. You are not in the right frame of mind to be dealing with shareholder meetings and zoning permits. We just want to look after you." I looked up at my son, the chief operating officer of a $40 million real estate empire, a title I had essentially laid at his feet. He could not bring himself to meet my eyes. He was fixed on the marble countertop. I took a slow sip of tea. I let my posture sink even further, leaning into the role of the shattered, oblivious old man they so badly needed me to be. "Maybe you're right, Garrett," I whispered, gazing blankly at the wall. "I am just so incredibly exhausted. I can't seem to string a clear thought together today. Let me get through the week. Then we can talk about this retreat." Claudia's eyes caught the light. It was a brief, hungry flash of triumph she couldn't quite suppress. "Take all the time you need, Edmund," she purred, patting my hand gently. "We are family. We take care of our own." The rest of the evening blurred past in a procession of hollow exchanges. The guests slowly trickled out, leaving the vast Philadelphia estate feeling emptier than it ever had. The catering staff gathered their silver trays and disappeared into the night. Garrett and Claudia announced they were heading upstairs to settle little Finn down for the night in the guest wing. They offered to bring in a cleaning crew for the study, but I waved them off, insisting that keeping my hands occupied would help me work through the grief. They didn't push back. They were far too eager to slip away and toast their imagined victory behind closed doors. Alone at last, I walked back into my private study. The air in the room still felt contaminated by their scheming. I moved around my massive mahogany desk, the very surface where I had signed the contracts that built their entire lives. I began collecting the scattered sympathy cards and empty glasses left behind by the guests. My mind was running hard, tallying every asset, every trust fund clause, every scrap of leverage I had over them. If they wanted a war, I would deliver them a masterpiece of absolute destruction. But I needed hard proof of their current moves before I sprang the trap. I reached under the desk for the small wastebasket, meaning to dump it into the recycling bin. As I pulled it free, I noticed a strange clump of shredded paper sitting at the very bottom. It was completely out of place. My cleaning staff emptied that bin every single morning, and I had not touched the shredder in days. I set the basket on the desk and switched on the brass reading lamp. With slow, deliberate care, I turned the contents out onto the smooth leather surface. Someone had been in a hurry. They had used the old strip shredder instead of the heavy-duty cross-cut machine I kept for sensitive documents. I settled into my heavy leather chair and slid on my reading glasses. My hands, which had been performing their trembling act barely an hour before, were now perfectly steady. I arranged the long, thin strips of paper like a jigsaw puzzle under the warm yellow light, nudging the torn edges together piece by piece. It took me 10 minutes to reconstruct the document. When the text finally lined up, the breath stopped dead in my throat. It was not a sympathy card or a misprinted office memo. It was a banking confirmation receipt printed fresh that very morning. The header carried the logo of an elite European auto importer located downtown. The transaction was a direct wire transfer for exactly $120,000. The listed item was a custom-ordered Porsche, but it was not the staggering price that turned my blood cold. It was the account the funds had been drawn from. The money had not come from Garrett's personal trust or Claudia's generous monthly allowance. The transfer was billed directly to a corporate vendor account labeled Apex Design Consulting, a vendor approved and signed off by the Chief Operating Officer of Hargrove Developments. Garrett. My own son had just authorized a massive 6-figure corporate payment to a phantom consulting firm, and Claudia had tried to destroy the evidence right here inside my own study while we were simultaneously burying my wife. I stared at the reassembled receipt, the audacity of the theft burning through me like an open flame. They were not merely planning to cage me in a luxury facility and strip away my legacy. They were already actively draining my company from the inside. I carefully gathered the paper strips and slid them into a clear plastic folder. I pulled my phone from my pocket, its soft glow cutting through the dark room. The time for playing the harmless grieving widower was finished. It was time to hunt. I locked the study doors. I needed complete privacy. These walls held too many secrets, and I was about to drag the darkest one into the light. The house was silent. I retrieved my encrypted laptop from the safe and set it beside the reconstructed receipt. I drew a slow breath and lifted the screen. I logged into the financial mainframe of Hargrove Developments. Garrett had been feeding me polished summary reports engineered to look healthy, but I was the founder. I felt the muscle memory of old corporate battles guiding my hands. I bypassed the executive dashboard and went straight into the raw transaction logs. I entered my master credentials. The screen flooded with financial data, the lifeblood of my $40 million empire. I typed Apex Design Consulting into the vendor search field. The Porsche receipt was just the tip of a massive iceberg. Wire transfers filled the monitor. $50,000 for brand strategy, $80,000 for market analysis, $150,000 for international expansion. The payments ran back 8 months, growing larger as my wife grew sicker. I scrolled to the bottom. They had siphoned nearly $4.2 million straight out of our cash reserves. I clicked through to the authorization stamp on the largest transfer. An executive signature appeared on the screen. It belonged to the Chief Operating Officer, Garrett. My son had systematically signed away millions to a ghost company while his mother lay dying. This was no accident. It was a calculated financial drain. I printed every ledger page. By sunrise, I had a thick stack of irrefutable evidence locked securely in my safe. I needed to look my son in the eye and watch him try to defend his theft. I walked down to the kitchen. Garrett was already there pouring himself a cup of dark roast coffee. He looked perfectly rested, sharp in a navy suit. I shuffled into the room, keeping up the act of the broken widower. My hands trembled slightly as I reached for a glass of water. "Good morning, Dad," Garrett said, his voice layered with manufactured concern. "Did you get any sleep?" "A few hours." I lied, settling heavily onto a stool at the island. "Garrett, I was trying to distract myself last night. I glanced through some quarterly summaries you'd sent over just to keep my mind from wandering." Garrett stiffened almost imperceptibly, lifting his coffee cup for a slow sip. "You should not be worrying about work today, Dad. I have everything completely under control. You need to concentrate on resting." "I know," I muttered, staring at the granite countertop. But I came across a vendor name I didn't recognize. The Apex Design Consulting. The figures looked quite large. What exactly do they handle for us? I watched him carefully, waiting for some crack of panic, but Garrett did not flinch. His expression stayed perfectly calm. He smiled with the patient ease of a teacher walking a slow student through a simple problem. "Oh, Apex Design," he said smoothly. "They are an elite marketing firm based out of Europe. We brought them on to manage our upcoming overseas commercial expansion. It's a heavy upfront investment, but the projected returns are substantial." A dangerous surge of anger rose in my chest. He was lying directly to my face. I nodded slowly. "I don't recall signing off on an international marketing firm of that scale," I replied softly. Garrett leaned back against the counter, crossing his arms in a casual, easy gesture. And then he crossed a line. that sealed his absolute destruction. "You didn't sign off on it, Dad," Garrett said, dropping his voice into a tone of quiet, reverent calm. "Mom did." The air in the kitchen suddenly felt impossibly thin. "What did you say?" I whispered. "Mom approved the vendor contract just a few weeks before she passed." Garrett lied without so much as a blink. "You were so consumed with managing her doctors, she didn't want to burden you with the operational details. She gave Apex Design her full blessing. She wanted to make sure the company kept growing for Finn's future. It was her final executive decision." A wave of pure nausea rolled through me. He was weaponizing Eleanor's memory, twisting her legacy into a shield for his own miserable embezzlement. It took every scrap of discipline I had to stop myself from reaching for his expensive silk tie. I forced a weak, trembling smile. "That sounds exactly like your mother," I whispered. "Always protecting the family." "Exactly," Garrett agreed, patting my shoulder as he moved past me toward the hallway. "I'll see you tonight." I stood alone in the kitchen. My son was entirely lost to me. I poured the rest of his coffee down the drain and felt a cold, iron resolve settling deep into my bones. I walked back toward my study, craving quiet isolation. I drifted to the massive bay window overlooking the sprawling backyard. The morning sun poured down over the green lawns. Claudia was outside wearing a stunning designer dress and cradling a cup of tea as she talked on her cell phone. She was laughing, looking utterly radiant just one day after my wife had been lowered into the ground. Then the back patio doors flew open. Little Finn, my 5-year-old grandson, came charging out onto the grass. He was clutching a small wooden toy boat, his face blazing with joy as he sprinted across the lawn toward his mother. He wanted a hug. "Mommy, look!" Finn shouted happily, rushing toward Claudia with his arms flung wide. Claudia did not smile. She did not open her arms to catch her running child. Instead, as Finn reached out to wrap his arms around her waist, Claudia recoiled violently. A flash of sheer disgust crossed her face. She shoved the boy away, batting at his hands with a sharp, dismissive swat. "Get off me, Finn!" she hissed. "You have dirt on your hands. Do not touch this dress. It is pure silk. Go play with the nanny." Finn stumbled backward, squeezing the little wooden boat to his chest. The joy drained from his face, instantly replaced by a look of heartbreaking rejection. He stood there in the grass, staring up at his mother with wounded eyes. Claudia did not even glance at him. She smoothed down the fabric of her expensive dress, turned her back on her child, and went straight back to laughing into her phone. I stood motionless behind the glass, the breath caught in my throat. I had known many cold people across decades of corporate life, but the revulsion in Claudia's eyes when her own son tried to embrace her was something altogether different. It was not the sharpness of a strict mother. It was the reaction of a woman who found that child's very touch repellent. My instincts began screaming. The massive financial theft, the scheme to warehouse me in a care facility, the frantic push to transfer company shares into the name of a 5-year-old boy, a boy that his very own mother looked at with undisguised contempt. The rot inside my house was not simply about stolen money. It ran somewhere far darker and far more sinister. I stood at the window, watching the little boy trudge sadly back toward the house. A terrible suspicion began its slow crawl up my spine. That suspicion gnawed at me without mercy over the days that followed. I kept mostly to my study, quietly watching the household dynamics rearrange themselves around me. Claudia moved through the mansion with growing authority, snapping orders at the staff in a tone Eleanor would never have stood for. I kept up my performance, shuffling past her in the hallways, offering empty smiles and vague nods. I needed her to feel utterly secure in her grip on things. I needed her to believe I was dissolving into the background of my own home, fading into nothing more than a harmless ghost. It was on a Thursday morning that the next piece landed squarely in my lap. I was sitting at the kitchen table, forcing myself through a bowl of oatmeal, when Rupert, our private family driver of 12 years, walked in. He looked deeply uncomfortable, turning his uniform cap over in his hands. He cleared his throat and told me that Claudia had just terminated his employment, effective immediately. I set my spoon down, feigning mild confusion. When I asked why, Rupert explained that Claudia had told him the family was restructuring household expenses to trim some extra costs. Restructuring expenses. The sheer audacity of that woman. She was funneling millions into a phantom corporate account, yet she was terminating a loyal employee to save a few thousand a month. It was a calculated move to tighten her control over the household, to strip out anyone who might carry word back to me. I thanked Rupert, handed him a generous severance check drawn from my private account, and told him to take a long, well-earned vacation. Shortly after Rupert left, Claudia swept into the kitchen. She poured herself a glass of sparkling water, looking immensely pleased with her latest ruthless move. I asked her mildly how Finn was getting to his private prep school now that Rupert was gone. She gave me that polished, practiced smile and told me not to give it a second thought. She'd arranged for a distant cousin to handle Finn's transportation and afternoon tutoring. A family favor, she called it. I simply nodded and thanked her for taking such initiative while I was supposedly drowning in grief. But every instinct I had was screaming. You do not dismiss a trusted, bonded family driver and replace him with a distant cousin for daily runs, unless you are concealing something you cannot afford the household staff to witness. That afternoon, I made certain I was settled on the front porch, tea in hand, a blanket across my knees, when the time came for Finn to be collected. The heavy wrought iron gates of the estate swung slowly open. A low, throaty rumble rolled up the long, paved driveway. A sleek, brand-new midnight blue Porsche eased to a smooth stop at the grand entrance of my home. My breath caught. I recognized the make and model without hesitation. It was the exact car from the shredded banking receipt I had so painstakingly pieced back together in my study. The $120,000 vehicle purchased with funds drained from Hargrove Developments. I gripped the armrests of my rocking chair, forcing my face to stay completely blank as the driver stepped out. He was a man in his late 30s, wearing a sharply tailored suit with no tie. He had slicked back dark hair and the arrogant, aggressive physical swagger of someone who had never once been told no. He put me on edge the moment I laid eyes on him. He did not carry himself like a humble cousin stepping up to do the family a favor. He looked like a man who believed he already owned the driveway he was standing on. Claudia stepped out through the front door, pulling Finn along by the hand. The moment she caught sight of the man by the Porsche, everything about her shifted. The rigid, guarded posture she kept around me evaporated completely. She practically lit up from within. "Well," Claudia said smoothly, gesturing toward the driveway. "This is my cousin Colt. He recently moved to the city and offered to help out with young Finn." I rose slowly, making a deliberate show of leaning on my cane for balance. I descended the porch steps and extended my hand. "Nice to meet you, Colt," I said, keeping my voice thin and raspy. "It is very generous of you to step up for our family during such a difficult time." Colt took my hand. His grip was firm aggressively, so the handshake of a man trying to establish dominance over someone he had already written off as a fading relic. "Happy to help," Colt replied, flashing a broad, self-assured smile. "Family sticks together, especially in hard times. Am I right?" I nodded and thanked him again. But as I stepped back, I watched the unspoken current running between the two of them. It was impossible to miss for anyone who knew how to read people. Claudia was standing just a fraction too close to him. The way Colt looked at her was not the easy warmth of a distant relative. His eyes moved over her designer outfit with raw, undisguised hunger. And when his gaze drifted from Claudia to the stone facade of my estate, that hunger hardened into something else, entirely pure, unchecked, proprietary greed. He was studying my home as if he was already mentally rearranging the furniture. Then Colt turned his attention to little Finn. "Hey there, buddy," Colt said, his voice dropping into a surprisingly warm, affectionate register. "Ready to go work on some numbers?" Finn, who normally shrank back from strangers, lit up immediately. He dropped his mother's hand and made the beeline straight for Colt. Colt laughed a deep, full sound and reached down without hesitation, sweeping the 5-year-old boy up into the air. Finn dissolved into giggles, locking his small arms tightly around Colt's neck. It was a portrait of effortless, unrehearsed warmth, a stark and chilling contrast to the revulsion Claudia had shown the boy only days before. I stood motionless on the bottom porch step. The late afternoon sun fell cleanly across their faces as Colt balanced the boy on his hip. Both of them were laughing at something Finn had murmured into his ear, and in that one unguarded moment as their faces were pressed side by side, the floor dropped out from under me. I stopped breathing. The world around me seemed to narrow and go silent, collapsing into a dim, ringing void. I stared at the man and the child, unable to look away. When Finn laughed, the left corner of his mouth always pulled up slightly higher than the right. It was a distinctive little quirk, a small, asymmetrical smile we had always assumed was a unique family trait. But as Colt laughed, his mouth curved in the exact same way. The exact same crooked, asymmetrical smile. A wave of suffocating realization crashed over me. Garrett was not the father of this child. The boy who held the keys to my legacy was a complete genetic stranger. I stood frozen on that bottom step, staring at the man and the boy, the same crooked smile mirrored on both faces. The truth struck me with the force of a freight train. Garrett was not this child's father. The boy being paraded as the sole heir to the Hargrove legacy, the child I had poured my heart into, carried none of my bloodline. He was the son of Claudia and this arrogant man standing in my driveway. The betrayal was so total, it physically knocked the air from my lungs. My grief for Eleanor was instantly swept aside by a cold, clear, calculating state of war. I kept my expression neutral. I offered Colt a frail nod, turned, and shuffled slowly back inside. Every step was a performance, a defeated old man retreating to his chair. I walked into the kitchen and waited in the shadows. 10 minutes later, Claudia and Finn came in. Finn went straight to the sink, grabbed a glass, filled it with water, and drank deeply before running off to the playroom. Claudia followed him without a backward glance. I moved quickly. I retrieved a pair of latex gloves from the pantry, then carefully lifted the glass Finn had just drunk from and sealed it inside a clean plastic bag. Then I went back out to the front porch. The evening shadows were spreading long across the lawn. I walked down the path to the spot where Colt had parked his Porsche. I scanned the concrete. There, pressed against the edge of the flower bed, was a discarded cigarette butt. I crouched down, ignoring the protest in my knees, and collected it with a second plastic bag. 2 pieces of physical evidence. 2 biological keys to dismantle a deception 5 years in the making. I slipped both bags into the pocket of my coat. I waited until the house fell completely silent. At midnight, I slipped out through the side entrance, taking my modest sedan and leaving the luxury vehicles untouched in the garage to avoid drawing any notice. The streets of Philadelphia were slick with a light rain. I drove 20 miles outside the city, heading toward a secluded 24-hour diner near the industrial shipyard. It was the kind of place no corporate executive would ever set foot in, a place where absolute privacy was the given. I parked in the shadows and went inside. I settled into a worn vinyl booth in the far back corner. 10 minutes later, the diner door swung open. Raymond Keswick walked in. He was 62 years old, wearing a sharp overcoat. Raymond was not simply my attorney. He was a genuine shark in the courtroom, a man who had helped me dismantle corporate adversaries without mercy for 3 decades. He slid into the booth across from me, his keen eyes moving over my face. "You look terrible," Raymond said quietly. "When you rang me on a secure line at midnight, I assumed it was about Eleanor's estate. I am so sorry for your loss." "Thank you, Raymond. But I am not here to talk about Eleanor. I am here because my son and my daughter-in-law are actively working to destroy me." I reached into my pocket and produced the clear plastic folder holding the reconstructed, shredded Porsche receipt. I slid it across the table. Raymond put on his reading glasses and studied the document. His professional composure sharpened instantly. "This is an authorization for $120,000, Raymond said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous murmur. "Signed by Garrett. Billed to a vendor called Apex Design Consulting. I don't recognize this vendor, Edmund." "Neither do I," I replied, my voice flat and cold. "I bypassed the executive dashboard last night and went straight into the raw transaction logs. Garrett has pushed over $4 million into this shell company over the past 8 months. He did it while Eleanor was dying. I need you to launch a covert forensic audit immediately. Track every single penny that flowed into Apex Design. Find out who owns it, where the money is landing, and who is pulling the strings." Raymond's jaw tightened. He drew a secure, encrypted laptop from his briefcase and powered it up. "Consider it done," he said, his fingers already moving across the keys. "If Garrett is channeling corporate funds into a ghost account, I will have the full paper trail mapped within 72 hours. But Edmund, if we expose this, Garrett faces serious federal charges. Wire fraud. Embezzlement. He is your son. Are you absolutely certain you want to cross this line? He made his choice the moment he decided to bleed my company dry and have me locked away in a care facility. But the money is only half of the betrayal." I reached into my coat pocket one final time. I set the 2 plastic bags on the table beside the reconstructed receipt, one holding the water glass, one holding the crushed cigarette butt. Raymond stopped typing. He looked at the bags, then up at me, deep confusion crossing his face. "What is this?" he asked carefully. "The glass belongs to my grandson, Finn," I said, my voice perfectly level. "The cigarette belongs to a man named Colt, who conveniently appeared today driving a brand new Porsche purchased through Apex Design. He and Claudia are far closer than cousins, and he and Finn share the exact same physical mannerisms." Raymond stared at the evidence on the table. The horrifying implication settled over him slowly. He took his glasses off. "My God," he whispered. "You believe the boy is not Garrett's son." "I do not believe anything, Raymond, I know. But I need undeniable science to prove it. I want a DNA test run on both samples. I want the results expedited, and I want it handled quietly through your private medical contacts. No one in my family can have the slightest idea. I need the weapon fully loaded before I pull the trigger." Raymond nodded slowly, deliberately packing the plastic bags into his briefcase. "I'll have the lab run a complete panel. We'll have results in 3 days. Edmund, if you're right about this, Claudia has engineered an extraordinarily massive fraud. She's positioning a biological stranger to inherit the entire Hargrove legacy." I leaned back against the worn vinyl booth in the far back corner. That was precisely her scheme. but she had made one fatal mistake. She assumed my grief had hollowed me out. She thought I was a clueless old man who would just roll over and disappear. I was going to let her believe she had already won. I was going to smile at her face every single morning. And when she was completely at ease, I was going to bring the entire sky crashing down on her head. Raymond didn't smile. His eyes stayed locked on his laptop screen. The pale blue light washed across his face, throwing deep shadows along his cheekbones. He'd been running a preliminary trace on the Apex design routing numbers the whole time we talked. I watched the color drain from his face rapidly, completely. He went still for a solid 5 seconds. "What is it?" I pressed, leaning forward. Raymond turned the laptop screen slowly toward me. His hands were actually trembling. "Edmund," he said, his voice falling to a terrified whisper. "The $4 million was only the testing phase. They've successfully bypassed the secondary security protocols on the primary Hargrove Trust accounts. They've scheduled a massive automated offshore wire transfer." "What are you talking about?" I asked, my heart hammering hard against my ribs. Raymond looked me dead in the eyes. "They're not just taking the cash reserves, Edmund. They've liquidated the commercial bonds. They're draining your entire legacy by Friday." Raymond's words hung in the stale diner air like a death sentence. By Friday, they were going to strip everything I had built across 40 years and vanish without a trace. I stared at the glowing blue screen of Raymond's laptop, watching the automated pending transfers tick forward. The sheer scale of their greed was breathtaking. I told Raymond to prepare the legal injunctions, but to hold off on freezing the accounts until I gave him the absolute final signal. I needed them to feel completely victorious first. If we moved too early, Claudia would frame it as a corporate misunderstanding, a tax strategy, or some other manufactured excuse. I needed to catch them with their hands locked firmly inside the vault. I drove back to the estate as the sun began climbing over Philadelphia. When I came through the front doors, the house was just stirring awake. I knew exactly what had to be done. If Claudia and Garrett wanted a declining, dementia-ridden old man, I was going to give them a performance worthy of an Oscar. Over the following 2 days, I staged a masterpiece of apparent mental collapse. At breakfast, I poured orange juice into my coffee mug and stared at it in blank confusion. I deliberately forgot the name of our longtime housekeeper, calling her by my late sister's name instead. I'd wander into the kitchen, glance around with hollow eyes, and ask Garrett what day of the week it was. And each time I performed one of these calculated acts of frailty, I watched Claudia. She was absolutely intoxicated by my apparent unraveling. She stopped dropping her voice when she talked to Garrett about her plans. She stopped pretending to care. She started treating me like a ghost already clearing out of the building. My manufactured helplessness was her greatest source of power. Wednesday afternoon arrived exactly 2 days before their planned financial massacre. I was making my way up the grand staircase, gripping the railing with trembling hands, playing my part. As I neared the master wing, a harsh, grating sound cut through the hallway. The heavy, unmistakable drag of a thick plastic trash bag across hardwood floors. I moved slowly toward the open doors of the master suite, the bedroom I had shared with Eleanor for 4 decades. I stopped in the doorway, and what I saw nearly shattered my carefully constructed facade. Claudia was standing in the center of Eleanor's enormous closet. In her hands, a heavy black garbage bag. She was casually yanking my late wife's expensive silk blouses, vintage dresses, and cashmere coats off their wooden hangers and forcing them into the trash. Not folding them, not setting them aside for donation, throwing them away like worthless rags. "What are you doing?" I asked, letting my voice shake with genuine emotion. Claudia didn't even flinch. She dropped a beautiful emerald green coat into the plastic bag and released a long, exasperated sigh. Edmund, you startled me. Don't sneak up on people like that. I'm clearing this space out. You clearly don't need all this clutter anymore. It's completely depressing. But those are Eleanor's things, I whispered, gripping the doorframe. Claudia rolled her eyes, cinching a hard knot at the top of the garbage bag. Eleanor is gone, Edmund. You need to come to terms with that. Garrett and I decided that this suite gets the best morning light in the whole house. I'm bringing contractors in tomorrow to gut these outdated shelves. I'm turning this room into my private yoga studio. I can't focus on my wellness with all these old clothes hanging around. A private yoga studio. My wife had not been in the ground for a full week, and this parasite was stuffing her life into heavy black trash bags to clear space for yoga mats. The disrespect was so profound, so deeply violating, that the edges of my vision actually went dark. My hands dropped to my sides. I clenched my fists so hard I felt my trimmed fingernails break through the skin of my palms. A warm trickle of blood pooled inside my closed hands. Every muscle in my chest screamed at me to cross the room, seize her by the shoulders, and hurl her straight through the second-story window, but the trap wasn't ready. Friday was 2 days out. I needed her to stay. If I unleashed my fury she'd simply pack her bags, take my grandson, and run before Raymond could fully freeze her hidden offshore accounts. I had to swallow it all down. I drew a long, agonizing breath, letting the metallic rush of adrenaline settle. Every instinct demanded violence, but strategy demanded absolute patience. Revenge is a dish best served on paper. I yielded to her. I buried it. I forced my bleeding hands to go still inside my coat pockets. I dropped my head, taking on the posture of a shattered, utterly defeated man. You're right, Claudia, I murmured softly, eyes fixed on the floor. It's just clutter now. Do whatever you think is best. She smiled that cold, triumphant smile. I'm glad you're finally being reasonable, Edmund. Go on downstairs. The cleaning staff is moving these bags to the alley dumpsters. I turned around and walked slowly away, leaving her to desecrate the last space Eleanor and I had shared. I went to my study and wrapped my bleeding hands in a towel, staring at the grandfather clock. The fury inside me was no longer a burning fire. It had become absolute freezing ice. I waited until 2:00. The mansion sat in dead silence. A heavy thunderstorm had rolled in off the coast, beating against the large glass windows with driving rain. I slipped out through the back door, indifferent to the freezing downpour. I made my way down the stone path toward the massive industrial dumpsters near the service entrance. The security lights flickered above me. My focus was consumed entirely by the grim task ahead. I refused to let Claudia erase 40 years of beautiful history just to feed her hollow, superficial vanity. I lifted the heavy metal lid. Claudia had forced the staff to throw at least 6 heavy black bags into the bin. I was not going to let Eleanor's life rot in an alleyway. I climbed in my expensive leather shoes, sinking into the grime. I hauled the heavy bags out one by one, dragging them quietly toward the detached carriage house, where I could store them safely. I brought the last bag inside the dry warmth of the carriage house. The plastic had torn against the rough concrete. As I knelt to gently gather the spilled garments back inside, my hand caught on something hard and metallic buried deep in the folds of the fabric. I stopped. I reached into the torn bag and pulled out Eleanor's emerald green cashmere coat, the exact coat Claudia had tossed aside so casually while I stood watching from the doorway. I slipped my hand into the deep side pocket. My fingers closed around a small, heavy rectangular object. I drew it out into the dim light of the carriage house. It was a cheap, prepaid burner phone, completely out of place among the fine possessions of our home. Claudia had clearly been using it while clearing out the closet, and must have accidentally let it slip into the coat pocket before throwing everything in the trash. I stared at the dark screen. The device felt heavy in my palm, humming with unspoken secrets. I pressed the small plastic power button firmly on the right side. The cracked screen slowly lit up the cold, damp room, glaring bright, demanding a simple 4-digit security passcode to unlock. The number pad glowed in the dim carriage house, its artificial light throwing cold shadows across the concrete around me. Just 4 digits keeping me from the truth I needed. My thumb hung above the screen. Part of me wanted to punch in Claudia's birth year or the date she and my son had married. But the instincts that had kept Hargrove Developments airtight for 40 years shut that impulse down hard. A career spent defending proprietary systems had taught me better. Burner phones like this one came with tripwires built in. Too many wrong attempts, and the device would wipe itself clean. Every message, every photo, every call record, gone in seconds, and with it, the foundation of my entire trap. That was a risk I couldn't take. I held the power button until the screen went dark, then tucked the phone against my chest, deep inside my jacket. What I needed was someone who lived in the gray space where corporate law didn't reach a specialist in pulling data from devices that weren't meant to be opened. Back during the hard-charging expansion years of Hargrove Developments in the early 2000s, I had quietly hired private intelligence contractors to dig beneath the surface of major acquisitions. I returned to my study and unlocked an encrypted offline directory I hadn't touched in 7 years or more. The name I was looking for was Dax, a black market data retrieval expert, a ghost in the machine who cracked impossible devices for clients, wealthy enough to pay and careful enough to keep quiet. I sent him a heavily encrypted message laying out the phone model and exactly what I needed. Inside 3 minutes, my secure line came back with a set of coordinates somewhere in the city's industrial belt. Outside, the storm had only gotten worse, hammering my windshield with cascading walls of rain as I wound through the empty, waterlogged streets. The address resolved to a windowless concrete warehouse behind a perimeter of razor wire. I pressed my coat against the wind and pounded on the reinforced steel door. It opened without a sound, pulling back to reveal a room that felt more like a server farm, blazing white light, floor-to-ceiling racks of hardware, cooling fans running a constant low roar. Dax occupied a stainless steel workstation at the center, his face lit a pale blue by 3 monitors, arranged in a wide arc. No introductions were made. We didn't need names. The arrangement ran on a simpler currency: urgency and untraceable money. I set the burner phone on his desk and placed beside it a thick envelope holding $25,000 in crisp, unmarked bills. Dax palmed the envelope, gauged the weight in one practiced motion, and dipped his chin once. He ran a chain of adapters from the phone into the guts of his mainframe, then went to work, fingers hammering keys, running proprietary decryption tools, engineered to slip past the operating system's defenses without tripping the wipe protocol. The only sounds in that space were the mechanical clatter of his keyboard and the drone of cooling fans cycling endlessly. I didn't move. My wet clothes were cold against my skin. My eyes stayed on the progress bar inching across the middle screen. Every breath felt like work. 40 minutes dissolved in total silence. Then a clean, melodic tone rang out across the room. The center monitor flooded green. The lock was broken. Dax unhooked the device with quiet efficiency, bridged it to an external hard drive, and pulled a full copy of the unencrypted contents. He gave me back the physical phone, and alongside it a small silver flash drive carrying every text, every image, and every call record the device had ever held. I made it back to the estate just ahead of the first pale light pushing through the breaking clouds. The entire house was silent and still. I sealed myself inside my study, drew the blackout curtains across every window, and slid the silver flash drive into my isolated desktop machine. The directory came up at once. I opened the master message thread and sorted everything oldest to newest. What I saw stopped me cold. Claudia and Colt had been in constant contact, hundreds of exchanges every week, sustained across 5 full years. Reading through them felt like stepping into a sewer. Every message reeked of premeditation. My son was their favorite target. They had written about the way predators discuss prey, calling him a pathetic, gullible weakling, a useful idiot who kept their lifestyle afloat without asking a single question. They joked about the resort trips Garrett had financed, vacations where Claudia had slipped Colt into the same 5-star hotels under Garrett's nose. The cruelty in those texts was almost incidental, though a side current beneath the main current of something far more calculated. Their real obsession, the thread running through nearly every exchange, was the total and permanent destruction of the Hargrove family empire. The most recent messages were the most detailed. Claudia wasn't content to pocket the $4 million she had already bled through Apex Design. She was coming for everything. The scheme that emerged from those texts was built around the annual Hargrove Development shareholder meeting set for next month, a date they had clearly been engineering toward for a long time. Claudia had been tutoring Colt in the mechanics of corporate governance. The play they had designed was cold, clean, and perfectly timed. She was going to walk into that boardroom and turn my grief over Eleanor into a weapon. Fake tears for the executives. A trembling voice. A public declaration that I had lost the mental capacity to lead. She would hold up my own staged confusion as clinical evidence that I needed to be removed immediately. The goal was to push the board into forcing my resignation and handing the CEO title to Garrett. The moment Garrett sat in that chair with full legal authority, Claudia would steer him into executing a catastrophic merger with a shell company Colt controlled entirely. They were going to legally strip the company of its assets, bankrupt the entire corporate structure, and walk away with tens of millions of dollars, leaving my son holding the bag for massive federal fraud. I sat reading that and felt my blood drop several degrees. I pushed to the bottom of the thread, the final message sent by Colt just yesterday afternoon, shortly after he'd swung by the driveway to collect Finn. Brief. Only 2 sentences. But those 2 sentences were the last piece I needed to finish building their coffin. I read them twice, making sure every word registered. He had written, "Are you sure the kid's DNA won't be questioned by the board if the old man transfers the shares to Finn? We are multimillionaires." The sheer confidence of that line. They genuinely believed they had run circles around a man who had spent his whole career hunting people exactly like them. I sat there in the low-light rain, still tapping at the glass behind me. My hands didn't shake. The grieving widower was gone. What remained was something colder, harder, and far more patient. The man who had built an empire by knowing exactly when to strike. I pulled the flash drive from the port and sealed it inside my hidden floor safe. Every piece was in place. The trap was set. The safe door closed with a dull, final click. I got to my feet and felt the morning chill pressing through the study windows, the last teeth of the storm still biting at the glass. Outside, the sky was clearing to a flat bruised gray, the same color as the resolve that had settled into my chest. I crossed to the mahogany desk and lowered myself into the chair. The house around me was absolutely quiet, weighted down with everything I now knew. Then my private phone rang and split the silence open. I checked the screen. Raymond Keswick. Raymond didn't dial at this hour without a reason, which meant something had broken, confirmed, or arrived. I picked up without speaking. "Edmund," he said, clipped serious, the easy warmth completely gone from his voice. Get to my office, now. The forensic audit wrapped overnight. The printed reports are already on my desk waiting. I let a breath out slowly and kept my voice flat. So the medical lab results, I asked. Came in 10 minutes ago. Raymond answered and let the silence that followed do its work. You need to be here in person, Edmund. Come through the private underground garage. My security people will meet you and bring you straight to the executive floor. I set the phone down, moved to the bathroom, ran cold water over my face and held my own gaze in the gilded mirror for a long moment. The fragile, grieving widower looking back at me was finished. I straightened my collar, pulled on my darkest suit, and walked out. The route into downtown Philadelphia was nothing but gray concrete bleeding past at speed. What I was about to learn, what my own son had truly been doing behind my back, would cost more than I can put into words. Before I tell you what I uncovered that night, let me ask you this: if you discovered someone you deeply trusted had been quietly working against you, would you confront them immediately? Or would you gather every piece of evidence first and let the truth do the talking? I pulled the corporate sedan into the underground parking structure beneath Raymond's high-rise building. 2 armed security guards were positioned near the private elevators, nodding as I approached and swiping a keycard that sent the steel car straight to the 50th floor without a single stop. The doors parted with a quiet tone, opening onto a glass-walled reception area, clean and hushed. Raymond stood at the panoramic window of his corner office, looking out at the city spread below him. He turned when I entered, his face pale and drawn tight. He motioned toward a heavy leather chair across from his desk. I settled into it, planting my hands on the armrests. The desktop was buried under layered stacks of financial ledgers, wire transfer records, and legal routing documents, the paper anatomy of my son's betrayal laid out in full. Tell me everything, I said, keeping my voice low and controlled. Raymond lifted the topmost file, a dense collection of international transfer receipts and offshore banking records. You were right on every count. His tone was clinical, stripped of warmth. Apex Design Consulting is a phantom. No employees, no physical address, no real clients anywhere on their roster. The business license was filed in a notorious offshore tax haven exactly 3 weeks before Garrett authorized the first wire transfer. I leaned in, studying the paperwork. And the ownership who controls the shadow accounts. Raymond turned to the second page of the audit and drew a circle around a specific signature block with his silver pen. The sole proprietor of Apex Design is Colt Whitfield, the same man who rolled up your driveway in that imported Porsche. He's the only named beneficiary of the entire shell structure. A wave of hot, focused anger moved through me. Colt, Claudia's supposedly distant cousin, the man who had stood on my grounds, looking at everything I owned like he was already pricing it. They didn't stop at the cash reserves, Raymond continued, his voice dropping. We traced the routing numbers through 3 separate international clearinghouses. Over the last 8 months, Garrett signed off on 47 individual transactions. They laundered $200,000 out of Hargrove Developments, entirely run through fabricated invoices processed as international marketing expenses, then deposited straight into Colt's private offshore trusts. I sat staring at those ledgers, the numbers burning themselves into me. $40, $200,000, stripped away while my wife was fighting to survive in a hospital bed. Garrett had handed over the keys without a second thought, financing his own wife's affair and signing the documents that would bury him. Claudia played him perfectly, I said, and I could hear the cold disgust in my own voice. She turned his arrogance against him, that desperate need he always had to prove himself as an executive. She pushed those contracts in front of him, knowing he would never think to vet the vendor properly. She told him Eleanor had already approved the arrangement, and he swallowed it without question. Raymond closed the financial folder and pressed his hands flat on the desk. The financial theft alone is devastating, Edmund. What we have here is enough to put both Garrett and Colt behind federal bars for a very long time. But that is only half of what I have to show you. He reached into the top drawer and brought out a sealed, thick manila envelope. The embossed logo of an elite private medical laboratory stood out in white across the front. The room seemed to contract. The only thing I could hear was the low mechanical hum of the building's ventilation system. Raymond pushed the envelope across the polished mahogany surface. It stopped just short of my hands. "This is the hard part," he said quietly, and there was something in his eyes, genuine sorrow. I rushed the samples through the most trusted clinical contacts I have. They worked through the night to sequence the genetic markers from the water glass and the cigarette butt. What came back is beyond dispute. I stared at the brown paper envelope, my pulse striking a slow, heavy beat against my chest. I reached out, caught its edge between my fingers, and tore the seal. Inside was a single sheet of crisp, white medical paper. My eyes moved past the scientific notation and landed on the bold, highlighted conclusion at the bottom of the page. The probability of paternity is 99.9%. The child Finn is a direct biological match to the adult male Colt. The page fell from my hand and settled soundlessly onto the desk. The breath left my body. Garrett was not the father. That beautiful boy, my grandson, the child I had held and loved, was biologically a stranger to this family. Claudia had run a 5-year, multi-million-dollar deception. She had placed Colt's child inside my home, married my unsuspecting son, and systematically bled the Hargrove legacy dry to build an empire of her own. Everything was now exposed. I walked out of Raymond's office with the manila envelope tucked inside my breast pocket, its weight pressing against my sternum like a slab of cold iron. The drive back to the estate passed like movement through deep water, the world outside the windshield barely registering. Claudia's 5-year deception kept running on a loop in my mind. She had brought another man's child under my roof, accepted Eleanor's warmth and generosity without a flicker of conscience, and used my own son as the instrument of our destruction. Every brick of that house, every dollar I had accumulated over 40 years had been in her crosshairs. But they had made a catastrophic miscalculation. They thought they were closing in on wounded prey. What they had actually done was wake the wolf. When I came through the grand mahogany front doors, the house sat perfectly quiet around me. I found Garrett and Claudia in the main living room. Claudia was stretched out on the white sofa, paging lazily through a designer catalog on her tablet. Garrett stood at the wet bar, pouring expensive scotch, a man toasting a victory he hadn't actually collected yet. I stopped in the archway. I pulled in a long, slow breath. I let my shoulders cave forward, let my spine curve, let myself look worn through and entirely beaten. I let my hands tremble visibly against the wooden doorframe. Garrett. Claudia. My voice came out thin and rough, scraped hollow with manufactured exhaustion. "I need a word with both of you." Garrett looked up, rearranging his expression into something approximating concern. He put the glass down and came over, steering me gently toward a plush armchair. "What's going on, Dad?" he asked softly. "You look terrible. You're white as a sheet." "I'm not well, Garrett," I said, dropping my gaze to my shaking hands. "These last few days I've been telling myself I could push through, that grief was something I could outwork. But Eleanor is gone, and without her I don't have what it takes anymore. My thoughts won't come clear. My chest hasn't stopped aching. I can't lead Hargrove Developments in this state. The company needs someone sharp and focused." Claudia set her tablet down on the glass coffee table with deliberate care. Her eyes opened a little wider, lit from behind, with something she couldn't quite contain, an intensity she was working to disguise as concern. She leaned forward, drinking in my every word like a woman who could already taste what was coming. "What exactly are you saying, Edmund?" she asked, her voice barely holding steady with anticipation. I looked at my son and let a single tear form in the corner of my eye. "I'm saying it's time for me to step aside," I replied, quiet and resigned. "You've earned it, Garrett. You know this market in ways I no longer can. I've already been in contact with legal representation. At the executive board meeting this Friday, I am formally resigning as Chief Executive Officer and signing my majority voting shares directly over to you." I paused, drawing a slow breath. "Beyond that, I'm restructuring the Hargrove Family Trust. Everything will move outside of probate and into a secure, protected fund held in trust for my rightful grandson, Little Finn. He is the future of this family, and I want his legacy guaranteed and untouchable." The living room went absolutely still. Garrett stood there with his mouth slightly open, too stunned to speak, unable to believe the kingdom was simply being handed across. But Claudia didn't wait. Every trace of the patient, sympathetic daughter-in-law evaporated in an instant, replaced by something radiant and almost frantic. She came off the sofa and dropped to her knees beside my chair, seizing my trembling hands in both of hers and squeezing with a grip that was anything but tender. "You, Edmund, this is the most generous, selfless thing you could possibly do." She breathed, her eyes blazing with undisguised hunger. "We are so proud of you for seeing clearly enough to recognize your limitations. You're doing what's right for the company and for our precious little Finn. We will honor everything you've built. You have nothing left to worry about." Garrett finally found his voice, straightening his jacket, his chest swelling with an arrogance he had not earned. He stood a full inch taller. "You're making the right call, Dad. I'll take the reins and drive Hargrove Developments into a major global future. You can finally rest now." "Speaking of rest," Claudia cut in quickly, rising from the sofa and smoothing her pristine skirt. "Now that the corporate transition is sorted, we need to finalize your personal transition." I looked up at her, feigning mild confusion. "My personal transition?" I asked, making my voice thin and uncertain. "Yes, Edmund," she replied, folding her arms with practiced ease. "Ivory Glen Luxury Health Retreat. We already went over this. You've just admitted your mind is slipping and your health is going downhill. You can't remain in this enormous empty house. It simply isn't safe for you. I've already spoken with the admissions director. There's a beautiful private suite opening up this weekend." I let my mouth drift open slightly, blinking as though the words were slow to reach me. "You want me out of the estate by this weekend?" I murmured. "It's for your own good, Dad," Garrett added, moving to stand alongside his wife. "The medical staff at Ivory Glen can keep track of your cognitive decline. We'll come see you naturally, but you need professional supervision." I looked at both of them. They weren't even attempting to mask the eagerness beneath their concern. The corporate transfer papers weren't even drawn up yet, and they were already pushing me out the door of the home I had built for my family. I dropped my gaze to the intricate patterns of the Persian rug beneath my feet. "All right," I whispered in a hollowed-out voice. "If you both believe it's for the best." "We do," Claudia said, and her tone had shifted entirely. The manufactured sympathy was gone. She spoke now as the woman who owned this house to the man who had outstayed his welcome. "You should begin packing your things at once, Edmund. Just the essentials. The facility provides uniforms and basic toiletries. I'll have the housekeeping staff bring up some cardboard boxes for the rest of your clutter. I want that study emptied by Thursday evening. The interior decorators need to come in and measure the space." I nodded in silence, playing the obedient, broken elder to absolute perfection. I eased myself out of the chair with deliberate slowness, leaning heavily on my wooden cane, and began the long, humiliating walk up the grand staircase. Behind me came the sharp, festive crack of a champagne cork. Claudia's laughter rang out bright, unguarded, triumphant, and I heard her glass touch Garrett's. They were toasting the end of my era. I climbed to the top of the stairs and moved down the long hallway toward my private study. The moment I crossed the threshold and turned the lock on the heavy oak doors, everything changed. My posture snapped upright. The trembling left my hands without a trace. The frail, wandering old man dissolved into the still air of the room, and the man who had built a corporation from nothing stood in his place. I went directly to the desk and opened the floor safe. I spread out the forensic audit Raymond had assembled, the DNA laboratory results, and the decrypted files from Claudia's burner phone, arranging each stack with precise, unhurried care across the polished mahogany. I sat down, picked up my secure, encrypted cellular phone, and dialed a direct, unlisted number I had held in memory for over a decade. It rang twice before a sharp, professional voice came on the line. Federal Bureau of Investigation, Financial Crimes Division, Special Agent Garvey speaking. Agent Garvey. I said, my voice smooth and level and commanding. My name is Edmund Hargrove, founder and chief executive officer of Hargrove Developments. I'm calling to report a large-scale, ongoing wire fraud and embezzlement operation being carried out inside my own corporation. A brief pause. The agent clearly recognized the name. The Hargrove Empire was a pillar of the regional economy. Mr. Hargrove, the agent replied, his tone sharpening immediately. Do you have physical evidence to support these allegations? I have a complete forensic audit documenting over 4 million laundered through international shell companies, I said. I have the offshore routing numbers, the phantom vendor contracts, and the decrypted internal communications of the conspirators who are actively plotting a hostile corporate takeover and intend to drain the remaining assets this coming Friday. Who are the primary suspects, Mr. Hargrove? The sound of rapid keystrokes carried over the line. The primary suspects are my chief operating officer, Garrett Hargrove, and a civilian accomplice named Colt Whitfield. I answered without hesitation. I am prepared to surrender all physical and digital evidence immediately. I want your best forensic accountants at the estate tonight. We have exactly 48 hours to close a trap they won't see coming. While Claudia stood downstairs drinking expensive champagne and mapping out where her yoga mats would go, I was upstairs methodically assembling the guillotine that would separate her from everything she believed she had won. The board meeting on Friday was not going to hand anyone a kingdom. It was going to be a reckoning. Friday arrived on a cold, sharp wind, sweeping in off the Philadelphia harbor, carrying the last of the storm with it. I stood before the full-length mirror in my dressing room, setting the collar of my suit with steady hands. For the better part of a week, I had deliberately worn slightly rumpled clothes, let my shoulders cave forward, and shuffled my steps to maintain the fiction of a deteriorating mind. Today, I dressed as the man I had always been, the man who had raised a $40 million empire from the ground up. I knotted my silk tie, fastened my heavy watch, and slid the leather portfolio holding the forensic audit, the digital extractions, and the DNA results into my briefcase. I descended the grand staircase of the estate for what I understood would be the last time under these particular circumstances. The house was quiet. Garrett and Claudia had already gone chauffeured downtown in their eagerness to arrive first and claim their prize. I walked out into the crisp morning air and settled into the back of my private sedan, instructing the driver to head straight to the financial district. The city moved past the windows in a stream of gray concrete and early commuters. My mind was perfectly still, tuned entirely to the frequency of corporate warfare. The Hargrove Development's tower rose 50 stories from the pavement, a monument in glass and steel that I had personally designed and put my name on. I came through the revolving lobby doors, and the security staff and front desk attendants straightened instinctively as I passed, offering quiet, respectful nods. I bypassed the bank of standard elevators and used my keycard for the private executive lift. 45 seconds to the 40th floor. With each level that slid past, I allowed the remaining grief over Eleanor to recede deliberately, replacing it with something colder and more precise. The elevator opened onto the marble floors and frosted glass walls of the executive suite. I moved down the corridor toward the main boardroom. The heavy oak double doors stood open. I paused just outside and listened. The board of directors, 5 men and 2 women who had worked alongside me for decades, were already arranged in their high-backed leather chairs, murmuring among themselves, no doubt weighing the shocking agenda of my supposed resignation. I stepped inside and the room fell quiet all at once. I crossed to my customary seat at the head of the table and set my briefcase carefully on the floor beside me. I gave the board a quiet, measured smile, keeping just a trace of the old man's slump in my shoulders for a few minutes longer. Garrett was seated immediately to my right, in the chair traditionally held by the chief operating officer. He looked wound tight, tugging repeatedly at his cuffs, avoiding eye contact with anyone around the table. Claudia sat directly beside him. She held no seat on the executive board, no official role within Hargrove Developments whatsoever, but she had pressed her way into this meeting under the pretense of being my devoted daughter-in-law. She looked luminous, glowing with an arrogance she was no longer working to contain. She wore a stunning, custom-tailored cobalt dress that commanded attention. But it was the jewelry she had draped across herself that turned my blood cold, a flawless diamond collar and matching tennis bracelets. Pieces worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Pieces bought with the lifeblood of my company. She sat perfectly straight, chin lifted, surveying the boardroom as though she were already reviewing her newly acquired territory. She turned to me as I took my seat and offered a sweet, pitying smile, the kind you give a confused patient who has wandered somewhere he no longer quite belongs. The chief legal counsel, a meticulous man named Clifford, cleared his throat and opened his thick binder. He called the quarterly shareholder meeting to order and began reading through the preliminary financial summaries in a flat, unhurried monotone, his voice filling the room with the practiced drone of procedural certainty. He paused, then fixing me with a deeply sympathetic expression. Clifford announced that the primary item before the board was a sweeping corporate restructuring, specifically my request to relinquish the position of Chief Executive Officer on grounds of rapidly deteriorating health. The board members traded nervous, sorrowful glances around the table. They had known me for years. They understood how profoundly Eleanor's death had hollowed me out, and Claudia had clearly spent the preceding days working the room quietly, planting the idea that my mind had come apart entirely. Before I could so much as open my mouth to address the board formally, Claudia shoved her chair back and stood. The harsh scrape of wood across the floor cut Clifford off mid-sentence. She hadn't asked permission. She pressed both hands flat onto the polished mahogany and leaned forward, the flawless diamonds at her throat, catching every drop of overhead light. The careful performance she had maintained all morning fell away in an instant. The warm, worried tone she had polished to a gleam for country club circles was gone. What replaced it was sharp, surgical, and laced with contempt. She swept her gaze across the board members and then locked her eyes directly onto mine. "Now that the old woman is gone," Claudia said, her voice carrying through the silent boardroom with breathtaking cruelty, "there is no reason to drag this any further. We all know why we're sitting here. Edmund's mind is finished. He is a liability to this company and a dead weight on this family. She gestured toward Garrett, who immediately dropped his chin and fixed his stare on his own hands, complicit in his silence, drowning in his cowardice. "Put the company in my son's name and get out of the way," she said, her gaze driving into mine with open, unmasked greed. "My son Finn is the only future this family has left. Sign the majority shares over right now and step aside. New blood is long overdue, Edmund. Pack yourself off to the nursing home and let the real executives run this business." The entire board sat frozen. They stared at her, stunned by the sheer cruelty of it. Garrett sank further into his chair, visibly sweating, incapable of stopping his wife or defending me against a single word. The air in that room had turned dense and heavy, with the unmistakable pressure of a corporate execution in progress. Claudia stood there, chest rising and falling, waiting for me to crumble, surrender the empire, and shuffle quietly into obscurity. I placed my hands flat on the table. Slowly, deliberately, I let the trembling and the fragile posture dissolve. I rolled my shoulders back, straightened my spine to its full height, and met her gaze head-on. The smile I gave her was slow and measured, and it dropped the temperature in the room by several degrees. "I would love to accommodate that, Claudia, but there's a small legal complication." The heavy oak doors at the back of the boardroom crashed open with a force that split the silence like a thunderclap. Every head at the table whipped toward the entrance. Raymond Keswick walked in. Not the measured, tactful Raymond of conference calls and courtroom pleasantries. This was someone else entirely. He wore the expression of a man arriving to carry out a sentence. On each side of him moved a figure in a dark, immaculate suit, their bearing stiff and precise, radiating the kind of authority that doesn't need to announce itself. The silver badges clipped to their belts caught the morning light streaming through the panoramic windows. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had entered the room. Garrett half rose from his chair, his face twisting into bewildered panic. He looked at the federal agents, then at Raymond, then finally at me. "Dad, what is this?" He stammered, his voice cracking under the sudden weight of it. "Who are these men? Why are federal agents walking into a closed shareholder meeting?" I didn't answer him. I kept my eyes fixed entirely on Claudia. The radiant glow she had been wearing all morning flickered and died, replaced by a fast, sharp flash of calculating fear. She lowered herself back into her chair, slowly, both hands gripping the armrests, knuckles draining white. The diamonds at her throat suddenly looked like a collar. Raymond walked the full length of the room with measured, deliberate strides and stopped directly across from Garrett and Claudia. He unlatched his leather briefcase and drew out a massive 350-page bound document. He raised it and brought it down flat onto the center of the table. The impact cracked through the room like a gunshot. That dense, immaculate stack of paper contained every stolen dollar, every forged signature, and every fracture in the foundation of trust they had caused. "This meeting is no longer a question of executive succession," Raymond declared, his voice filling the room without effort. "This is an active federal crime scene. My client, Edmund Hargrove, has formally filed charges of gross corporate embezzlement, wire fraud, and criminal conspiracy against the chief operating officer of this company." A collective gasp moved through the board. A senior director at the far end of the table pressed a hand over his mouth. Clifford, our chief legal counsel, pushed his chair back from the table in a visible hurry, putting distance between himself and Garrett, as though guilt were airborne. Garrett swallowed. He had the look of a man watching a freight train fill the tunnel in front of him. "Raymond, you have completely lost the plot." Garrett tried scanning the room desperately for any face that might offer him an out. "There is no fraud here. Every action I've taken has been in the interest of growing Hargrove Developments." Raymond didn't blink. He opened the binder to the first divider tab. Let's examine your definition of growth. Garrett, over an 8-month period while your mother was dying, you authorized 47 separate wire transfers to an international vendor operating under the name Apex Design Consulting. You described them to this board as an elite European marketing firm. Our forensic accountants, working directly alongside the Financial Crimes Unit, spent the last 48 hours dismantling that claim entirely. Apex Design Consulting is a ghost. No employees, no physical offices, no campaigns of any kind. It is a phantom shell company registered in an offshore tax haven with one purpose: to drain this corporation. Garrett opened his mouth. Nothing came out. His face flooded deep red and then drained to a sickly ashen gray. Claudia stayed perfectly still beside him, her eyes moving between the federal agents and the audit on the table, her mind working at speed behind her controlled expression. You siphoned exactly $200,000 from the Hargrove cash reserves. Raymond continued, not pausing, reading straight from the ledger. You broke the transfers into smaller, staggered increments to slip past the secondary security protocols. You then liquidated the commercial bonds and were positioned to empty the primary trust accounts by tomorrow morning. You believed you were being extraordinarily clever, but you left a digital trail a mile wide. We traced every cent through 3 international clearinghouses and into a private offshore trust. Garrett raised both hands in a shaking, desperate gesture. Wait, he said, his eyes finding mine with the look of a man going under. Dad, please, you have to hear me out. His voice dropped. I didn't want to do this. Mom told me to. She approved the vendor. She said it was necessary for the company's future. Do not ever speak her name again, I said. My voice came out low, but it had enough force behind it to make several board members physically recoil. Don't you dare invoke my dead wife to cover your crimes. Eleanor built this company alongside me. She would never have blessed a phantom vendor, and she would never have pushed a single dollar toward a man named Colt Whitfield. The moment Colt's name landed in the room, Claudia flinched. Hard. The composed, imperious facade she had been holding cracked wide open. The queen was gone. What sat in her place was a cornered animal. But her greed ran deeper than her fear. She had spent too long imagining this empire as already hers to let it slip away without a fight. She shoved her chair back and got to her feet, jabbing a manicured finger across the table at Raymond, her voice rising to a pitch that rang off the frosted glass walls. You cannot do this. This is a private family matter, not a federal case. My husband is the chief operating officer of this company. He has full legal authority to direct corporate funds for the benefit of this business. Raymond looked at her with unvarnished contempt. Embezzlement is not a benefit strategy, Claudia. I don't care what you call it, she snapped, driving both palms onto the mahogany. She swung her glare to me and let the last shred of pretense fall away. You cannot touch that money, Edmund. You cannot freeze those offshore accounts. That money belongs to my family. My son Finn is the direct legal heir to the Hargrove Trust. You put it in writing when he was born. You created an irrevocable generational wealth transfer. The courts will protect his assets. No judge in this state will allow you to bankrupt your own flesh and blood. You are trapped, you senile old fool. Finn is a Hargrove, and that inheritance is his by blood and by right. Every soul in that boardroom went rigid, blindsided by the raw poison dripping from behind those perfectly painted lips. Claudia held herself upright, chest heaving, absolutely certain that a 5-year-old boy's biology had made her bulletproof. Raymond's face, as he studied her, held not a single trace of compassion. He gave one slow, deliberate shake of his head. His hand moved inside his jacket and came back out gripping a sealed manila envelope. He tore it open and drew out one sheet of heavy white paper, a bright blue certified medical seal stamped prominently across it. Raymond lifted the page toward the overhead light, angling it so every director around that table could plainly make out the official embossed seal of the testing laboratory. The room had gone so quiet that the soft crinkle of that paper might as well have been a thunderclap. Claudia's breath stopped dead. That self-satisfied smirk she'd been wearing evaporated in an instant, replaced by something that looked a great deal like naked dread. She knew that logo the moment her eyes found it. Philadelphia's most prestigious genetic testing facility. Raymond settled his reading glasses into place and turned his gaze squarely on my son, who was trembling now. Garrett. He said, his voice carrying none of the warmth or diplomatic cushioning a lawyer might normally deploy. 30 years ago, when your father drew up the primary Hargrove family trust, he demanded one non-negotiable provision be buried in its core. For a corporate empire of this size, such a safeguard is fairly standard practice. The bylaws are explicit: no transfer of wealth company shares or voting authority to the next generation can be recognized unless the recipient is a direct biological heir. Garrett's forehead creased. He blinked several times, struggling to follow. I'm not sure what point you're making, Raymond. Finn is my son, the direct heir. Claudia just confirmed that herself. Garrett said, his voice thin and unsteady. Claudia has said quite a lot of things. Raymond answered, his tone flat as stone. The science, however, tells a different story entirely. On Edmund's explicit instructions, I arranged for biological samples to be collected from your son Finn and from the man Claudia escorted into your home the day before yesterday, the one she introduced as a distant cousin by the name of Colt. Claudia was on her feet in a flash, both palms cracking against the mahogany surface. You had no right whatsoever. That is a blatant invasion of privacy. Testing my child without my knowledge or consent, that is illegal. You have committed a crime. I can't, and I did. I drove my voice straight through her spiral like a blade. The discarded biological material was gathered on the estate of which I am the legal owner. Every sample collected was entirely above board. Read out the findings, Raymond. Raymond dropped his eyes back to the page in front of him. He cleared his throat and let his voice fill the room, bouncing off those frosted glass walls. The comprehensive genetic analysis, processed and independently verified by 2 separate laboratory directors, places the probability of paternity between Colt Whitfield and the child Finn at 99.9%. He let that number sit in the cold air, let it do its damage in silence. Garrett, you did not father this child. Finn is the biological son of Colt Whitfield. Those words hit the center of the room the way a grenade hits a floor. The senior directors recoiled audibly. A woman at the far end of the table pressed her palm flat against her sternum, eyes fixed on Claudia with something beyond disbelief. The truth swelled in the air like something toxic, suffocating, dismantling every layer of the fiction Claudia had spent years constructing so meticulously. The theft wasn't only financial. She had plundered 5 solid years of my son's life. Every single morning he woke up and looked into the face of a boy he was sure was his own, she had let that lie stand. Garrett didn't move. He sat like a man who'd been completely hollowed out, every drop of color gone from his face. The hands lying on the table in front of him started trembling slowly at first, then beyond his control. He turned his head with great deliberateness toward his wife. The woman he'd gone to war with his own mother, to defend the woman for whom he'd siphoned away millions, the woman who had quietly gutted everything he'd built. Claudia. Garrett breathed the word, barely surviving his throat, crumbling into a wrecked, broken whisper. What is he saying? Tell them they've got it wrong. Tell them someone has manufactured all of this. Claudia lurched back from the table, her chair shrieking across the marble. Every bit of that polished, unshakable control she'd carried in here was gone. Cornered, that's exactly what she looked like. This is fabricated, Garrett. Your father has tampered with that document. He built this fiction from scratch because destroying us is all he's ever wanted. His contempt for me has never been a secret. You know exactly how he feels. He is stripping Finn away from you, that's the real agenda, so that pathetic company stays in his grip forever. Raymond tapped his phone screen calmly. The laboratory directors are patched into a secure conference line this very moment, Claudia. One call, and they will read every genetic marker on that report aloud right here for this entire board. Would you like me to connect them now? Claudia's mouth fell open. Nothing came out. Her eyes swept the room in frantic loops, hunting for a way out, for one face that might offer her something, and came back empty every time. The board members watching her wore expressions of open, undisguised revulsion. The woman who had reigned over the Hargrove Empire like royalty had been stripped bare in front of everyone. The wall Garrett had built around the truth finally gave way all at once. The realization didn't settle over him, it detonated. He lurched upright with a heaving chest, his leather chair toppling and hitting the marble with a crash behind him. He bore his eyes into the woman standing across the table, the one he'd believed was the mother of his child, and what came out of him was raw and guttural and agonizing. 5 years! Garrett bellowed, his face wrenched with grief and fury. 5 years of lies fed to me every single day. You pushed me to rob my own father. You made me cut my own family down. For what? So you could bankroll a hidden life with another man on the side. Claudia retreated along the far edge of the table, palms raised toward him, shaking. Garrett, stop, just listen to me. Colt was nothing, he meant nothing at all. Every dollar was meant for us, for what we were building together. I was protecting the life we had. You turned me into your instrument. Garrett's voice broke apart into a scream, tears pouring freely down his ravaged face. Not one moment of love, not one real second of it. I was never your husband. I was just your open wallet. He threw himself toward her, all reason gone, but he never made contact. The 2 federal agents who'd been standing at the edge of the room were already moving fast and precise as a trap snapping shut. One planted a forearm against Garrett's chest and drove him firmly back into the wall. The other closed the distance to Claudia in 4 steps. She stumbled backward until the frosted glass stopped her. Wide-eyed, breathless, she stared up at the agent looming over her. He seized her by both arms, turned her around with practiced efficiency, and drew her wrists together at the small of her back. The metallic snap of handcuffs locking into place rang through that silent room, sharp and clear, and I want you to understand. It was the finest sound I had heard in my entire life. Claudia Hargrove. The agent announced, his voice carrying the full, unmistakable weight of federal authority. You are officially under arrest for conspiracy, wire fraud, and gross corporate embezzlement. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of federal law. The steel cinched shut around Claudia's wrists with a cold, definitive finality. That sound cracked something open in her, the last membrane of disbelief finally ruptured. She sucked in a broken, ragged gasp as the agent pressed the cuffs snug against her skin. This had crossed over from boardroom theater into something far heavier and far more permanent. The federal justice system had arrived, and it was not interested in negotiation. She wrenched sideways, fighting the agent's hold, but there was nothing to fight against. His grip was total. The flawless diamond bracelets on her wrists clinked frantically against the hard steel restraints, a grotesquely fitting contrast between everything she had stolen and everything she was about to lose. Claudia's gaze swept the table one last desperate time, hunting for rescue. It landed on Garrett. He hadn't moved from beside his overturned chair, his face glazed with sweat, tracked with tears that had long since turned cold. The commanding man who had strode into this boardroom 20 minutes earlier was simply gone. What remained was a gutted, shrunken figure, every last piece of his dignity dismantled, laid out in ruins for the entire board to see. "Garrett, do something!" Claudia's voice tore itself apart as she screamed it. "You hold the title of Chief Operating Officer of this company. Make them release me. Tell them all this has been one enormous misunderstanding. Don't just stand there like a spineless coward." Garrett didn't lift a finger to help her. His chest shuddered with ragged, broken sobs, his eyes glassy and vacant, staring straight through her. The full weight of it had crashed down on him all at once. His marriage had been a transaction, a con, and the boy he'd raised and loved was another man's child. That knowledge had seized his mind completely. He was going under, drowning in humiliation so deep it had no bottom. He stared at that flawless face, the face that had looked him in the eye and lied to him every single morning for 5 long years, and he simply had nothing left to give. No power, no authority, no move to make. He had never truly held any of it. He'd been a piece on someone else's board the entire time, and the game had just ended. Seeing that her husband was completely useless to her, Claudia swung her pleading eyes toward me. All that venom she'd unleashed minutes earlier gone instantly replaced by the hollow performance of a terrified child. She tried to move in my direction, but the federal agent's grip held her exactly where she stood. "Edmund, please," she breathed, her voice shrinking to barely a whisper. "You cannot let them take me out of here like this. I am the mother of your grandson. I am family to you. We belong to each other. You have the power to stop this right now. I will return every last cent, every single penny. I will execute whatever corporate documents you require. Just call these agents off. Please, Edmund, show me some mercy. I was frightened about what was coming. Everything I did was to build a stable life for the boy." I stayed exactly where I was seated at the head of the boardroom table, both hands resting quietly on the polished surface. I met her eyes with a gaze that held nothing. No fury, no grief, certainly no mercy. The space where my love for this family used to live had gone cold and hollow, a void that felt permanent. I let her desperation fill the silent room for a long moment. Let the full enormity of what she'd done settle into her like stone. Then I spoke. "You told me to disappear from this family." My voice came out measured, unhurried, carrying the kind of calm that is more frightening than rage. "I am simply honoring your request." The final splinter of hope behind Claudia's eyes snapped. She pulled her mouth open to unleash another excuse, but the federal agent had already heard more than enough. He pressed a firm hand between her shoulder blades and drove her forward toward the heavy oak doors. "No." Claudia's cry tore upward into a shriek. "Edmund, you cannot do this to me. I earned that money. I earned my place inside this family. Get your hands off me. Don't you dare touch me." Her screaming cut through the executive floor like a siren as the agent steered her out into the main corridor. The entire 40th floor had ground to a halt. Senior vice presidents, executive assistants, marketing directors, even the cleaning staff had drifted out of their offices, pulled toward the noise. These were the exact same people Claudia had spent 3 years grinding beneath her heel, mocking, dismissing, treating like furniture. Now they stood in quiet rows, watching the immaculately dressed queen of Hargrove Developments being marched in steel handcuffs toward the public elevators. She tried to shield her face behind loose, disheveled hair, sobbing and stumbling utterly exposed, while those same employees watched with cold, unforgiving eyes. Her diamond necklace caught the harsh, fluorescent light of the hallway and threw it back in bright flashes, a glittering advertisement for her greed and the ruin it had brought her. The elevator doors parted. The agents guided her inside. The heavy metal panels slid shut, cutting her off from the empire she had schemed and bled to take for herself. The silence that settled back over the boardroom was thick and suffocating. The directors sat motionless in their high-backed chairs, still processing the raw, violent theater they had just witnessed. Raymond stood near the panoramic window arms, folded across his chest. The grim work he'd been handed now completed with total precision. I brought my attention back to the center of the room. Garrett was still on his feet near the overturned chair, shaking hard, his expensive suit pasted to his body with cold sweat. Reality was finally landing on him, all of it all at once. His wife let out in handcuffs on federal fraud charges. His perceived son was the biological product of his wife's illicit lover. His entire professional standing had been methodically dismantled by a forensic audit that tied him directly to the theft of millions. He looked at the empty doorway where Claudia had disappeared, then dragged his tear-streaked face around to find mine. His eyes were huge, filled with something primal and suffocating. Every trace of the arrogance that had powered his betrayal had been burned away, leaving only the raw, naked terror of a boy who'd finally been caught with his hand in his father's safe. Garrett took one unsteady, lurching step toward the head of the table. Then his knees buckled entirely, sending him down hard onto the cold marble floor. He scrambled forward on all fours past the stunned stares of the seated board members until he reached my chair. He folded himself against my legs, arms wrapped tight around them, and pressed his wet, heaving face into the fabric of my trousers. "Dad." He wept the word, barely surviving his throat. "Dad, I swear I didn't know about the kid. Please save me. I'm your son." I looked down at the man clinging to my legs. His tailored suit was wrecked, soaked through with tears and the cold sweat of absolute panic. He peered up at me with bloodshot, desperate eyes, searching for the father who had always stepped in, always absorbed, the damage always made, the consequences disappear. He was waiting for that man to appear again. But that man no longer existed. He had died the night Claudia dragged that heavy black trash bag across the hardwood floor of the master suite. I made no move to comfort him. I did not lower a hand to his shaking shoulder. I stood completely still and let the heavy silence of that room press down on him from every direction. The board watched every second of it, their faces caught somewhere between pity and disgust. "You are not a victim, Garrett," I said, my voice bouncing off those frosted glass walls with a cold, hard edge. "You are a coward. You stood there and let that parasite desecrate the only ground your mother and I had left. You watched her tear Eleanor's beautiful clothes from the hangers and throw them out like worthless rubbish, and you did absolutely nothing. You poured yourself a glass of expensive scotch and smiled while she told me to pack my things for a nursing home. You handed her the keys to everything I built because you were too weak and too lazy to build anything of your own. You sold my entire legacy to bankroll a fraudulent, pathetic illusion. You are not my son anymore. You are merely a liability." Garrett flinched as though the words had physically struck him in the jaw. His grip on my legs loosened, and he slid back onto his heels, mouth working open and shut without producing a sound. I shifted my gaze away from him toward Raymond and the federal agents positioned near the door, then swept it along the full length of the mahogany table to address the board. Effective immediately, Garrett Hargrove is permanently stripped of his title as Chief Operating Officer of Hargrove Developments. All executive privileges, corporate access codes, and financial authorizations are revoked as of this moment. Furthermore, any and all unvested company shares previously allocated to him under the family trust are entirely canceled due to gross negligence and complicity in massive corporate fraud. The senior directors nodded in solemn agreement, committing my directives to the official meeting minutes without hesitation. Garrett let out a low, gutted whimper, understanding in that instant that the shelter of the Hargrove name had just been demolished around him. He looked up at me, his face wrecked and open. "Please, Dad." He managed, his voice shaking so badly the words barely held together. "I have absolutely nothing left. If you fire me, I will be destitute. You cannot just leave me with nothing." I looked back down at him, my expression holding not a single degree of fatherly warmth. "I am not firing you, Garrett," I replied smoothly. "Firing you would allow you to simply walk away from the catastrophic mess you helped create. Firing you would be a mercy that you absolutely do not deserve. You are going to stay right here at Hargrove Developments, but you are no longer an executive. You are hereby demoted to a base-level data entry clerk. You will be relocated to the sub-basement archiving department. You will work under strict constant supervision logging historical financial records for 40 hours a week." Garrett stared at me in sheer horror, unable to fully absorb the magnitude of his punishment. "A base-level data entry clerk," he whispered, his voice cracking with fresh tears. "You cannot do that to me. I hold a Master of Business Administration degree. I cannot be made to work in a basement. You will work wherever I direct you to work." My voice climbed in volume, commanding every eye in the room. "You facilitated the theft of $200,000 from this corporation. Your signature appears on every fraudulent vendor contract that funneled our company's reserves directly into Colt Whitfield's offshore accounts. You are going to report to that basement, and your wages will be aggressively garnished each week until every cent your charming wife stripped from my empire has been repaid. No vacations, no bonuses. The next 40 years of your miserable existence will be spent slowly settling your enormous debt to this company. And if you refuse, or if you attempt to walk away, Raymond will personally deliver your complicity files to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. You will follow Claudia into federal prison and spend the remainder of your natural life rotting in a concrete cell. The decision belongs entirely to you. You can be a prisoner of the federal justice system, or you can be a prisoner of Hargrove Developments. Choose. Right now." The crushing finality of my ultimatum broke over him like a wave. Garrett folded completely, pressing his forehead against the cold marble floor, shaking with loud, uncontrollable, pitiful sobs. He had lost everything within the span of a single hour. The beautiful, treacherous woman who had worked his mind like a puppet was at that very moment sitting in the back of a federal vehicle, wrists locked in steel. His personal wealth was gone, vaporized by forensic accountants and legal asset seizures. The prestigious title he had flaunted at every country club dinner had been ripped away publicly in front of his peers. And the father he had intended to warehouse in a nursing home was now his absolute unforgiving warden. He was utterly alone, caged inside a prison entirely of his own construction. I looked toward Raymond and gave a single firm nod. The attorney gathered the thick forensic audit and the genetic testing results and arranged them neatly back inside his leather briefcase. Around the table board, members began quietly shuffling their papers, preparing to close the most devastating shareholder meeting in the company's long history. I turned and moved toward the heavy oak doors, leaving my weeping son curled on the boardroom floor. The trap had been sprung, the parasites thoroughly extracted from my business. But stepping out into the quiet, immaculate executive corridor, a sudden heavy thought drove itself through my cold satisfaction. It stopped my feet on the carpet. The corporate betrayal was resolved. Claudia was finally facing the weight of the law. But one large, complicated fragment of her elaborate deception was still back at the estate. I thought of the 5-year-old boy sitting in the playroom. Finn was the biological product of Colt Whitfield and a calculating con artist. He carried no Hargrove blood whatsoever. He was the living, breathing embodiment of my ultimate humiliation. And yet he was also just a completely innocent young child. What exactly was I going to do about the innocent little boy named Finn? I stood in that quiet corridor, eyes fixed on the polished marble floor, the full gravity of that question pressing down on my tired shoulders. What exactly was I going to do about the innocent little boy named Finn? I am a ruthless businessman. My entire life has been spent dissecting profit margins, eliminating liabilities, and crushing whoever dared cross my family. Claudia had weaponized that very family against me, using a child as a Trojan horse to penetrate my legacy. By every cold, logical calculation, Finn was the ultimate symbol of my humiliation. He was a biological stranger, the direct offspring of the man who had conspired to dismantle everything I had built. Every corporate instinct in me demanded I sever all ties completely, casting the boy out alongside his treacherous mother. But when I closed my eyes, I did not see Claudia's greedy sneer or Colt's arrogant grin. I saw a 5-year-old boy on a rug in the playroom, carefully stacking wooden building blocks, looking up at me with wide, bright, trusting eyes. He did not ask to be born into a criminal conspiracy. He was collateral damage in a war he could not possibly understand. I am a hard man, but I am not a monster. Eleanor had loved that little boy. She had read him bedtime stories and baked him warm sugar cookies, entirely unaware of his true lineage. To abandon him to the foster system, or to the bitter ruins of Garrett's destroyed life, would be a profound betrayal of the limitless compassion my late wife had brought into this dark world. I walked back into my private office, dialed Raymond's direct extension, and issued a new set of instructions that brooked no argument. We established a deeply insulated, fully anonymous educational trust. The parameters were precise and entirely impenetrable. The fund would cover his basic living expenses, modest housing, and comprehensive tuition through private schooling all the way to his university graduation. But the trust was ironclad in every direction. Claudia would never be permitted to access a single penny of it, and the moment Finn turned 25, whatever funds remained would automatically dissolve into a charitable organization. He would have a solid foundation for a decent, ordinary life, but he was permanently severed from the Hargrove billions. He would have to build his own path on his own merits, well clear of the toxic shadow his mother had cast. With the boy's future quietly arranged, I turned my full, unyielding attention back to the open wounds of Hargrove developments. The forensic audit had exposed Claudia and Garrett. But corruption of that scale does not exist in a vacuum. It demands blind eyes, greased palms, and complicit silence across an entire tier of middle management. I spent the next 3 weeks operating with the cold precision of a military surgeon. I called every senior department head, executive director, and financial controller into the main boardroom one by one. I laid the offshore wire transfers, the deliberately bypassed security protocols, and the intentionally neglected oversight reports on the table in front of them. I accepted no weak excuses. I tolerated no apologies. Within 14 days, I formally terminated 6 regional vice presidents, 2 chief accounting officers, and the entire risk management division. I stripped them of their golden parachutes and made it clear that any claim for corporate severance would result in federal complicity charges being filed by morning. The purge was swift, brutal, and absolutely necessary. dead weight removed, but the void left behind opened a genuine opportunity. I looked down into the lower ranks of the company for the quiet, diligent people who had been consistently overlooked by Garrett's arrogant, incompetent circle. I found a brilliant junior analyst named Petra, who had repeatedly flagged the Apex design invoices only to be threatened with immediate termination by Garrett. I promoted her directly to Chief Financial Officer. I elevated project managers who had quietly upheld the values Eleanor and I had built this company on decades before. I rewarded loyalty, competence, and integrity, unyielding, unflinching integrity. The culture of the company shifted almost overnight, returning to the honorable foundation that had made it a formidable force in the industry. The poison had been drawn out, and the corporate body was finally beginning to recover. After the final termination was processed and the newly appointed executive board was officially seated, I walked out of the downtown tower for the first time as its unchallenged master. The sun was going down over the Philadelphia skyline, painting the harbor in long, warm bands of gold. The evening air felt genuinely different, lighter, cleaner, as though a toxic fog had finally broken and drifted away from the city streets. My private driver took the quiet residential roads back toward the estate. When the heavy iron gates swung open, I looked up at the stone mansion looming ahead. For several dark, agonizing months, this house had felt like a cold tomb, a monument to grief and the vile deception rotting inside its walls. I unlocked the heavy mahogany front doors and stepped into the grand, sweeping foyer. The house was completely still. The frenetic, self-serving energy Claudia had filled every room with was permanently gone. Garrett's cowardly, hollow presence had been scrubbed from the premises entirely. No more manufactured smiles, no more whispered conspiracies, no more heavy plastic trash bags being dragged across the hardwood floors in the dead of night. I moved slowly through the main living room, my footsteps echoing against the high, intricately vaulted ceilings. I moved with purpose up the grand, sweeping staircase and along the long, shadowed upper corridor, coming to a stop directly in front of the master suite. The space was pristine, restored exactly to the way Eleanor had lovingly tended it across 40 beautiful years. The silence pressing through that vast, sprawling estate was absolute and profound. It reached into every room, every hallway, every darkened corner, settling there like something permanent. But standing alone in the fading twilight, looking into the quiet darkness of my reclaimed home, I understood something deeply. That silence was no longer a weight around my neck. It was open space, an unwritten chapter waiting for ink. I had protected everything Eleanor and I had constructed together. I had cut the disease out of my family and my business with a steady hand. Battered by betrayal and entirely alone in the dusk, I was nonetheless undefeated completely and without question. My name was still my own. The empire was secure. I drew a slow, deep breath and felt for the first time in a very long time something close to genuine peace. I pulled the heavy wooden doors of the master suite shut behind me, turned and walked forward into the quiet night, ready to write the next chapter of my story entirely on my own terms. This was not the end. It was only the beginning. I smiled. 6 months went by after that defining evening in the empty estate. The sharp autumn winds of Philadelphia had given way to a bitter, freezing winter, which eventually softened into a bright and forceful spring. The seasons moved, and with them the entire shape of my existence shifted in ways that could not be undone. The federal justice system ground forward with methodical, crushing precision. The trial of Claudia and Colt was swift and merciless. The forensic evidence Raymond and the federal agents had assembled was airtight. There was no room for clever legal maneuvering or sympathy plays before the jury. I sat in the front row of the federal courtroom on sentencing day, dressed in a dark, tailored suit, watching the final act of their wretched conspiracy close. Claudia stood before the judge, stripped of her designer gowns and heavy diamond necklaces. She wore a standard drab prison uniform, hair flat face, pale, every trace of her trademark arrogance entirely drained away. When the judge delivered her sentence of 8 years in a federal penitentiary for wire fraud and conspiracy, she didn't scream or break down. She simply sagged forward against the defense table, finally crushed beneath the full weight of her own unchecked greed. Colt, given his extensive history of offshore money laundering and his role as the primary architect of the financial shell companies, received a considerably harsher sentence of 10 solid years. They were escorted out through a side door, wrists bound in heavy steel chains. I did not feel a single flicker of pity watching them vanish into the bleak shadow of the penal system. They had gambled with my family, and they had forfeited everything. My son Garrett was living out a very different kind of sentence. True to my word, I had not let him walk free. I kept him tethered to the structure of Hargrove Developments, but I stripped his life of every comfort he had never actually earned. He was forced to sell his sports cars, drain his retirement accounts, and liquidate every asset he owned, just to begin chipping away at the massive restitution he owed the company. Garrett vacated his sprawling suburban mansion and moved into a cramped, dark studio apartment on the industrial edge of the city. Every morning he rose before dawn, pulled on a cheap off-the-rack suit, and stood in the freezing rain waiting for the public transit bus into the financial district. He arrived at the towering glass building he used to command, bypassed the executive elevators, and rode the service lift down to the sub-basement. He sat in a windowless room beneath harsh fluorescent lights for 40 hours a week, manually entering historical financial data into our digital archives. I received weekly reports on his conduct. The senior managers noted he never complained, never requested a single break, and never once invoked his former title. He was a completely broken, humbled man, grinding away the enormous debt his foolishness had created. It was a punishing, grinding existence, but it was also the very first time in his entirely sheltered life that my son was earning his own way. With the toxic elements gone from my world, something remarkable happened. The heavy, suffocating fog of grief and the sense of cognitive unraveling that had shadowed me for months simply lifted. I seized control of Hargrove Developments without hesitation, arriving at the executive suite every single morning at exactly 6, running on a sharp, burning energy I hadn't felt in over 2 decades. The business instincts Claudia had so foolishly mistaken for senility came roaring back with devastating predatory precision. I personally negotiated 3 major international acquisitions, extending our corporate reach across 2 new continents. I dismissed lazy contractors, restructured our supply chains, and drove our quarterly profit margins to levels the company had never seen before. The board of directors, who had once looked at me with quiet, nervous pity, now watched with something closer to reverent awe. I was not simply back. I was sharper, more formidable, and considerably more dangerous than I had ever been. But accumulating wealth was no longer the point. The betrayal had delivered a painful lesson about what legacy actually means. Eleanor had never measured our success in bank balances. She measured it in people in communities built in shelter, offered in warmth, extended to those who had nothing. I chose to honor her in the only way that carried any real weight. I directed a substantial portion of our recovered capital into a sweeping philanthropic initiative. We acquired large tracts of neglected, deteriorating land in the city's poorest districts. I brought in the finest architects and urban planners and set them to work designing beautiful, sustainable, genuinely affordable housing complexes. We named it the Eleanor Hargrove Foundation. It was not a superficial tax shelter dressed up as charity. It was a permanent, substantial commitment, to rebuilding the broken communities of Philadelphia. Every brick laid, every community center opened, every family given a roof, each one a living tribute to the woman who had shared my life and taught me what it was actually for. Standing on the construction site of the first housing complex, watching steel beams climb into a bright blue sky, I felt her presence beside me, quiet and steady. The empire wasn't merely reborn. It was finally serving a purpose worthy of her name. 6 months of relentless effort, legal battles, and corporate reconstruction had walled off most of the lingering pain. I had turned every wound into fuel, channeling the betrayal into something productive and forward-facing. But there remained one significant emotional debt I had deliberately left unaddressed. One place I had not been able to bring myself to visit while the fight was still underway. Now, with the company flourishing, Garrett facing his reckoning, and my enemies sealed behind concrete walls, the armor around my heart began slowly to soften. It was late on a Friday afternoon when I left the downtown tower. I dismissed my driver and took the keys to my own car instead. The sun was already low, stretching long golden shadows across the city streets. I drove in silence, leaving the glass towers of the financial district behind me. The traffic thinned, giving way to quiet, tree-lined roads that curved toward the peaceful outskirts of the city. My hands tightened on the leather steering wheel as the familiar wrought iron gates of the Memorial Park came into view. I turned onto the narrow gravel path, tires crunching softly in the deep stillness of the grounds. I parked beneath a sprawling ancient oak and cut the engine. I sat there for a long time, staring through the windshield without moving. I had won the war. I had salvaged the empire. But I had not spoken to her since the day everything came undone. I finally went to her. The late afternoon breeze moved through the old oak's branches, turning the dry autumn leaves in a soft, familiar rustle that felt almost like a greeting. I crossed the perfectly kept grass, slowly, my leather shoes pressing into the cool, damp earth with every step. The Memorial Park was entirely deserted, the deep, unbroken silence I had needed for so many months finally surrounding me completely. I stopped before the polished marble headstone. Her name was carved into the stone in clean, deep letters, Eleanor Louise Hargrove, fixed there, forever protected from the ugly, treacherous greed that had briefly poisoned our home. I reached into the pocket of my dark coat and drew out 2 delicate crystal glasses and a small sealed bottle of her absolute favorite aged single malt scotch. I worked the cork free carefully, the rich and familiar scent rising at once into the cool evening air, drawing a rush of warm memories forward from somewhere deep. I poured a modest measure into each glass. One I set gently against the cool marble base of her headstone. The other I kept in my right hand. I looked at her name and felt something soft and steady settle inside my chest. I kept my promise, Eleanor. I said, my voice quiet but firm in the stillness of the park. The empire we built together is entirely safe. Those who moved against our legacy have been permanently driven out. Claudia is sealed away in a high-security facility where she will never again work her manipulation on another trusting, unsuspecting soul. Colt is confined to a bleak federal cell, every grandiose delusion he carried completely stripped from him. And Garrett, my voice snagged for just a fraction of a second, but I pulled it back. Garrett is finally absorbing the brutal necessary lesson that actions carry weight. He is grinding away for his own survival, every ounce of that hollow arrogance gone from him. He is no longer a liability hanging around my neck. He is simply a man working to repay an enormous debt. I raised the glass and drew a slow, careful sip, letting the deep, complex warmth of the scotch move through me, those same flavors she had treasured so completely in life. I took in the sprawling, peaceful grounds surrounding me in every direction. I also looked after the boy. I went on, dropping my voice lower. I made sure little Finn will have a proper, well-funded education and a safe, stable roof over his head through all of his growing years. I did that for you, Eleanor. Your heart never could have lived with the idea of an innocent child paying the price for a treacherous mother's sins. But he is permanently severed from the Hargrove wealth. The work of our lifetimes is now pouring into the philanthropic foundation. We are constructing homes for the people who genuinely need them, just as you always dreamed we would. Your beautiful spirit is at last reaching into the future of this city and shaping it. I remained there in the fading light for a long, long time, drinking slowly, quietly, sharing the still triumph of having survived everything that had been aimed at me. I am exactly 70 years old today. I am standing completely alone in the diminishing light of a vast, tranquil, empty cemetery. There is no wife to go home to, and I have effectively cut the cord with my only son. The great mansion I will return to tonight will carry nothing but the sound of my own footsteps moving through its halls. But as I finished the final measure of scotch and looked out across the rolling green hills stretching before me, an undeniable quiet surge of power rose up from somewhere inside. I had stared down the deepest betrayal a man can face, one that came from within his own home, and I had cut it out clean. I was no longer the grieving, exposed widower they had so confidently believed they could overpower and discard. I was the absolute, unchallenged master of my own domain, and what was mine would remain mine. Never read a man's silence as weakness, and never mistake the depth of his grief for the absence of his mind. When you forge an empire from your own sweat and blood, you learn with absolute clarity how to defend it when those who built nothing come to take it apart. Greed has a way of blinding arrogant people to a fundamental, unforgiving truth that those who generate real, lasting wealth always hold the final power to destroy the ones who attempt to steal it. True family is forged in genuine respect and loyalty that does not bend not merely in a surname written across a shared legal document. Betrayal that comes from inside your own walls is the most lethal poison a person will ever be made to swallow. But cutting it out, no matter how savage and agonizing the process, is the only path back to survival, to reconstruction, and to the deep, necessary healing of everything within you that was broken. I used to ride upon your shoulders thinking you could touch the sky. Every road felt less uncertain when I saw the world through your eyes. You were stronger than the mountains, taller than the northern pines. And when the winter winds were coming, you would stand between them and I. Time kept moving like the river slipping slowly off to sea, but no matter where life took me, you were always part of me. I am my father. Every step I take and every time I choose to stand when it's easier to break, I carry your courage in my heart, your fire inside my soul. And though the years keep moving on, your love still leads me home. You taught me strength is not in power, but in kindness when it's hard. You taught me how to keep on going when the road grows cold and dark. Every lesson, every story, every laugh around the flame lives within me like an echo calling softly out my name. And when I face my greatest battles, when I feel I can't go on, I can hear your voice beside me saying, "Child, you're stronger than you know. I am my father's daughter. Every step I take, every time I choose to stand when it's easier to break, I carry your courage in my heart, your fire inside my soul. And all the years keep moving on, your love still leads me home. One day the snow will cover footprints. One day the fire will burn low. But the things a father gives his daughter are the things that never go. Not the gold, not the stories, not the battles that he won, but the quiet way he loved her and the woman she becomes. I am my father's daughter, and I always will remain. Through every triumph, every loss, through every joy and every pain, the world may change around me. The stars may fade above, but I will always carry with me my Father's endless love. And when they ask me who I am, I'll smile and answer softly, I am my Father's daughter. I am my Father's daughter. If you've stayed with me this far, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart. This story took everything out of me to live through, and I hope something in it landed where it needed to for you. Looking back now, I can tell you that rebuilding after that kind of betrayal costs more than money. It costs sleep. It costs the version of yourself that still believed the people you loved were who they claimed to be. I believe God does not waste our pain, and the fire that came out of those months forged something in me that comfort never could have built. Here is what I would tell any person standing where I once stood. Never let grief be mistaken for surrender. Silence is not weakness. Sometimes it is the sharpest strategy you have. If someone in your own home is quietly dismantling what you built, gather your proof before you make your move. Emotion is loud. Evidence is final. The people who are loyal when it costs them something, those are your real family. A shared name on a document means nothing without genuine respect to back it up. And if you are ever tempted to walk away from something you built with your own hands, just to keep the peace, don't. Protect your legacy. You earned it. If this story stirred something in you, I would love to read your thoughts in the comments. And if you know someone who is quietly carrying a heavy betrayal right now, share this with them. It might be exactly what they need to hear today. Please subscribe to Dad Revenge so you never miss a story. I put everything into every single one of them. Thank you for spending this time with me. God bless you, and I'll see you in the next one.